If we want to know what makes humans different from other animals, perhaps we need look no further than the prefrontal cortex and the executive control of behavior that it enables. The human ability to plan, carry out complex tasks, and build complex tools and technologies probably stems from the massive growth of the prefrontal cortex in the human species. Throughout human evolution, the prefrontal cortex has grown remarkably, culminating in the modern human Homo sapiens and separating humans from all other animals. The size of the prefrontal cortex relative to the rest of the brain has also increased. Over the past 5 million years, while the brain itself has increased in size by a factor of 3, the size of the prefrontal cortex has increased 6-fold. In other words, the prefrontal cortex has become an increasingly important part of the brain and is likely one of the major reasons why humans appear to be so different from their animal cousins. The prefrontal cortex is located at the front of the brain, just behind your forehead. It is a center of executive function, and it controls much of what the rest of the brain does. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for abstract thought, decision-making, conflict analysis, social behavior, and control of the memory and attention. Why should executive control be so important? After all, many other animal species have much smaller or even non-existent prefrontal cortices, and they seem to manage quite well in doing what they need to do. However, for humans, executive control allows information processing and behavior to adapt from moment to moment, depending on our current goals. This allows us to live our complex lives. When we are driving on the highway, we have to pay attention to the road in front of us, we have to check our mirrors regularly, and we have to look out for road signs and traffic lights. These complex tasks that we have invented force our brain to do a number of different things, such as avoiding distractions, but also recognizing when a distraction is important. For instance, a child running onto a road might seem like a distraction from the main task of navigating the vehicle, but it still becomes a very important task at the moment when it happens, and in fact overrides the basic driving task. The brain also needs to focus on the driving task, but smoothly switch between other tasks such as navigation and climate control. In general, executive control functions include goal maintenance, conflict recognition, inhibition, and task switching. The prefrontal cortex is highly interconnected with other brain areas. In particular, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is on the upper part of the prefrontal cortex and on the lateral side, is strongly connected to areas controlling action, attention, and perception. Key areas within the prefrontal cortex include not only the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but also right below it, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex underneath the rest of the prefrontal cortex, and the medial prefrontal regions, including the anterior cingulate cortex. The prefrontal cortex is organized hierarchically from back to front. As a task becomes more complex or abstract, the area of activation in the lateral prefrontal cortex moves further towards the front of the brain. For example, in one experimental task, activation in the premotor cortex was the most important activation in a simple task related to the number of stimulus-response mappings that had to be maintained. However, in a version of the task where the response had to change depending on the color of the letter, activation moved further forward, and finally, in the most frontal area, activation was seen when there were variations in instructions from one run of the task to the next. So, for instance, the rules of the task might be reversed between runs. So by varying the complexity and abstraction of the task, experimenters could change whereabouts in the prefrontal cortex the activation was occurring. We also see a lot of connectivity of prefrontal cortex to different brain areas. And one of the most fascinating ones is the connection between the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the frontal eye fields, which control task-related eye movements. So this suggests that cognitive distraction caused by high loading the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex may actually create visual distraction by making it harder to sample the visual world around us, because the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is loaded and can no longer do as well in creating task-related eye movements. So in some ways, the critical role of executive functions in organizing and controlling the rest of the brain, while enabling the complex behavior that we are able to exhibit, also creates a kind of weakness where any overload in this area will affect many different functions in the brain. In terms of actively controlling tasks, there are a number of different executive functions or processes that have been identified. One of them is inhibition, which maintains focus on the current task and combats distractions. Another executive function is updating, which keeps track of task-relevant information. And a third important executive function is switching, which allows us to flexibly shift between tasks. We can use the driving task to highlight some executive control processes, and in particular the three that just mentioned. An example of inhibition is stopping a left turn when you see people on the crosswalk. You might, for instance, have been about to execute the turn, and then suddenly a vehicle that was obstructing the view of someone moves on, and you see the person on the crosswalk just as you were about to turn the wheel. This is a good example of inhibition. An example of shifting would be stopping the task of tuning the radio to check what is happening on the road in front. And an example of updating would be remembering the instructions from the radio about a blocked road and alternative routes to take. Research is ongoing about all the different executive control processes that seem to be involved in the human brain, but the general outline of executive control as an area in the prefrontal cortex that controls activity in other parts of the brain and maintains activation seems to be a key element of modern cognitive neuroscience.